Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Leslie Cohen. I'm the director of the Sonoran University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities, and I'm extremely happy today that you've all come to hear our great speaker. I first met Andy Imparato several years ago when, at that time, I was the director of the Center for Disability Law, and I was part of a state bar committee on people with disabilities in the legal profession, and we brought from DC Andy Imparato, a civil rights lawyer, disability advocate, to come speak to our group. And I was, wow. This guy not only had worked for the EEOC, for another protection and advocacy system, had been director of the American Association of People with Disabilities, and had worked for Senator Harkins as his disability policy lead. And that was several years ago. Since that time, Andy went back again and worked for Senator Harkins in a very important position, leading efforts on some of the most important disability legislation in the last years, and then came to his current position, which is as director of the National Association of University Centers on Disability. And that is where our paths crossed again. The Association of University Centers on Disability, AUCD, is really the membership organization for university centers like mine. And there are UCIDs, 67 of them across the US and territories, that are a real bridge between the university and the community, bringing that knowledge and information from the university to the community and back. Getting from the community what are the most important issues for policy, for research, for service development, for people with developmental and other disabilities. So I was very proud and happy to be part of the search committee that ended up hiring Andy here. And I am the immediate past president of the board of AUCD and have had the pleasure to work with Andy over the last couple years as he's pushed us, all of us university-based directors and academics, to look at the lives of people in our community, what people in our community want, and how we can best serve our communities through what we do best at the university: teaching, research, developing pilot and model programs, and disseminating information. So with that, I'm going to turn this over, and let's give a big hand to Andy Imparato. And as usual, I've forgotten who I should thank. So I want to thank Disability Resources Center, who's co-sponsoring this event, as well as the College of Public Health and the Public Health Training Center, the Western Region Public Health Training Center, and the Zuckerman College of Public Health, as well as the College of Law for their gracious help in this, and my good buddy Suzanne Rebay, who helped it happen. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andy Imparato.
Thank you very much, Leslie. Can everybody hear me okay? The back of the room? And is the assistive listening thing I'm wearing working? It's working. Okay, great. Well, I'm delighted to be here. I also want to say hi to people that might be watching this online and thank the folks that sponsored the online version of this. As Leslie mentioned, she was on the committee that hired me a couple of years ago. It was kind of an unusual hire. The Association of University Centers is run by people with PhDs and MDs generally, although Leslie is an exception. Leslie and I both have JDs, which in my wife's world, she's a PhD. We don't really count in terms of terminal degrees. I say that at a law school, no offense to the law students or lawyers in the room. But, I'm an open person with bipolar disorder. I'm an advocate. I'm an activist. I've spent most of my life doing organizing, coalition building, public policy advocacy inside and outside the government. So the fact that this group of university centers felt like that's what they wanted in their next leader, it was a pleasant surprise for me. It's been a wonderful 2 years. I'm amazed at the capacity in our network. Today was typical for me. I visited the center here that Leslie runs and learned about the work that they're doing across the border in Mexico, fitting people with affordable prosthetics and wheelchairs and hearing aids, with solar-powered batteries. I learned about the work that's happening around healthcare, and really, the cutting-edge work that this center is doing in a lot of different fronts. And I really feel like as a civil rights movement of people with disabilities and family members, we're very lucky to have these centers. And Leslie mentioned there are 67 of them. If you add all their budgets together, it's a $650 million network with about 6,000 people working in universities. In the network, we're in every state and territory. Here in Arizona, we have the Northern Arizona USED, which is up near Flagstaff, and then we've got this one. And you could think of it as a $650 million research and development arm and leadership development arm for the disability field. And to me, it's just so exciting to be able to work with Leslie and her colleagues and really see kind of what's possible for our network to do in partnership with independent living centers, in partnership with the DD councils and the protection and advocacy agencies and all the other community-based organizations, and in partnership with the disabled student services programs like the one here that Sue runs at the University of Arizona, which I had the opportunity to tour today, and I was really, really, really impressed with what you all are doing here, and I'll be talking about it on the rest of my travels, so I really appreciate the opportunity to do that. Just to fill in a little bit of my background, I think of myself as a second-generation disability activist. I graduated from law school in 1990, the year that the ADA was enacted into law. Fun fact, I was a visiting student at Harvard for my last semester of law school and had a class with President Obama. When he was a student there, we had local government law together. And I also, that semester was when I had my first serious episode of depression, and I ended up getting diagnosed with bipolar disorder, which I've been open about throughout my career. But when President Obama first came into the White House, he had a meeting with the disability community on the ADA anniversary in 2009, so the first anniversary after he took office. And I had a chance to go to the meeting and tell him that we had local government law together, and he said, that was a great class, and I said that was also when I had my first serious episode of depression, and he said, I hope it wasn't me. And I actually really liked it that he felt comfortable joking about disability, because in some ways that opens up a line of communication that's much healthier than people being afraid or not wanting to talk about it. So I think this year was the 25th anniversary of the ADA, and we spent a lot of time around the country talking about what have we accomplished in 25 years, kind of what is yet to accomplish. And one of the things that I think we don't always mention when we're looking at the impact of a civil rights law like the ADA is it made it possible for a generation of professionals like me to be out at work with our disabilities and have some protection against, unfair treatment or discrimination in the workplace. And, Zach participated in an internship program that we ran when I was at AAPD for college students with disabilities. This was a long time ago. Zach, when was it? A decade ago. Yeah, a decade ago. But Zach, I think you still count as part of the ADA generation. He's part of a group of folks who've come of age since the passage of the ADA. And I really feel like this generation of young folks, young adults, who are coming into the professions and lots of fields, they tend to have more pride in their disability identity. They tend to see a connection between their disability identity and other identities that they have. And I feel like that is going to result in a greater level or maybe a faster pace of attitudinal change. If you think about who's protected by the Americans with Disabilities Act, it's a very broad definition of disability, and the vast majority of the people who are protected do not have readily apparent disabilities. And if the folks who are protected by that law aren't out at work and talking about their disabilities at work, we miss the opportunity to have the kind of attitudinal change that the law envisioned. One of my good friends, Christine Griffin, who was a commissioner at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, really said that she thinks the best way to change attitudes towards people with disabilities is by having a positive experience working along somebody with a disability. So if you think about that 2/3 of the adult population with significant disabilities is not in the labor force, meaning they don't have any income and they're not actively looking for a job, that's a big missed opportunity to change attitudes. And then if a lot of the folks who are in the labor force don't feel comfortable being out at work, again, it's a missed opportunity to change attitudes. And as a second generation activist, I also feel a responsibility to work with my own children and others who are coming up, to kind of expose them to a civil rights, social justice model of disability. So I was practicing on my oldest son when he was in preschool. This was in Baltimore where we live. And they had a session where parents came in and talked about what we did for a living, and it was called Community Helpers. And the idea was, what do you do, and how does it help the community? So my wife, who's a history professor at a college level, came in with age-appropriate historical artifacts for the 3-year-olds, and she got them very excited about American history. And the preschool teachers were kind of wowed that a history professor at a college would know how to talk about history to 3-year-olds. So the pressure was on when it was my turn to come and talk about what I did. And at the time, I was at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So I wanted to get across that I was a lawyer, that I worked for the federal government, that I was focused on civil rights in the workplace, and that my specialty was disability civil rights. And somehow I thought the hardest thing in all of that for the 3-year-olds might be the idea of disability. So I was practicing on my son at home. His name's Anthony Gareth. We called him AG at the time. And I said, AG, do you know what a disability is? And he said, yeah. And I said, what is it? And he said, I don't know. And I said, well, like somebody who uses a wheelchair. Who do you know who uses a wheelchair? And he said, Chris Griffin, who was a special assistant for another commissioner. And she was very high on his radar screen because every time he came to visit me, Chris would come with presents or candy or something, and she was definitely kid-friendly. So then I said, or somebody who's blind and uses a white cane, who do you know who's blind? And he said, Chris Kaczynski. Chris worked at EEOC and commuted from Baltimore, so sometimes we would give him a ride home from the train. And then I said, AG, sometimes people have a disability, but you can't tell by looking at them that they have a disability. Some people call that a hidden disability. And I said, can you give me an example of a hidden disability? And he looked at me without missing a beat and he said, like being a lawyer? That's a true story. It's interesting that at that point in his life, most of the people that he knew that had disabilities were also lawyers. Now, some people would see that as a sign of progress for our disability movement, and some people might argue with that, but he definitely saw the connection. So, Leslie asked me to talk with you all today, and I really want to leave plenty of time to have a dialogue, but about the kind of question of, as we celebrate these milestone anniversaries this year, the 25th anniversary of ADA, the 40th anniversary of the special education law, those are the big ones that we're paying a lot of attention to in Washington. It's also the 50th anniversary of the Medicaid statute. and it's the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. And as we think about all of these milestones, I think it's really interesting to ask the question, where have we come from as a movement, and where are we going? And as somebody who's been in Washington since 93, so about 22 years, and who spent some of that time working with Senator Harkin, who I feel in a lot of ways has been a big part of where we've come from. He was the lead Democrat on the Americans with Disabilities Act. He was a freshman in the House when IDEA, the early version of the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, was passed. He was part of just about every major disability victory and piece of legislation, and was part of our major defeats, including our inability to deal with the institutional bias in the Medicaid program and our inability to get the United States to become a party to the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. What I've seen is incredible progress, but I've also seen that a lot of that progress is at risk, and that's really what I want to talk to you about today. You could think about it as kind of physics. You know, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, and I feel like in some ways, whenever we take a big step forward in the area of inclusion and empowerment and civil rights for people with disabilities, we often experience pushback. Some people call that a backlash, and then we have to deal with that and kind of protect what we have and then try to take another step forward. And I feel like in this era of the Obama administration, with very strong civil rights leadership and civil rights appointments, and forces in Congress and on the ground at the state level that don't always embrace the leadership that we've seen from the Obama administration, we see some of this one step forward, two step back dynamics. Just to give you some examples. Well, first, if you just look at the outcomes that we have as people with disabilities 25 years after the ADA, we have not seen any measurable impact of the ADA on the size of the disability labor force. Our numbers on this are never perfect because it's not always easy to identify who does and doesn't have a disability, but based on the monthly numbers we get from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the biggest population that we've had in the labor force of working age people with disabilities was 5.8 million people in September of 2008. And right now it's a little bit over 5 million. So we lost 800,000 people because of the economic downturn. It actually was in the 4 million, so we've gained some of them back. But we haven't even made up the ground of what we lost because of the 2008 recession. And if you look at other constituencies, most of those other constituencies have made up the ground and have gone beyond where they were in 2008. So we have a serious issue around employment. Again, the poverty numbers that we have for the disability population show that still 25 years after the ADA, people with disabilities have more than twice the poverty rates of the general population. And if you look at high school graduation rates for kids with disabilities as an important indicator, graduating with a regular high school diploma, we've seen some significant progress on that since the No Child Left Behind legislation was passed. We have better data on how kids with disabilities are doing compared to other kids. And we have seen about a 13 percentage point increase in high school graduation rates just in the last 12 years. But we're still well behind the general graduation rates for kids that we have through No Child Left Behind. So how does this kind of one step forward, two steps back work? Just one example would be on the issue of segregation versus integration. We had a major Supreme Court decision in 1999 called Olmstead, where the Supreme Court said that forcing somebody to receive services in a segregated setting is a violation of the ADA. And it involved two women with mental disabilities who were living in an institutional setting in Georgia. They wanted to get out of the institution and live in the community, and they used the ADA successfully to challenge the Medicaid rules in Georgia that were keeping them in the institution. even though the professionals in their lives were saying they were ready to live in the community. So in the Obama administration, we've seen aggressive enforcement of Olmstead at the state level. They had big settlements in states like Virginia, Rhode Island, Delaware, Oregon, and they've taken the integration model of Olmstead and applied it in the employment context. So in states that are having a lot of folks working in segregated or center-based employment, or we used to call sheltered workshops, they're challenging the funding streams that are supporting people in those settings and pushing states to have the money support people in integrated settings, not just integrated from the sense of who they're living with, but also integrated from the sense of who folks are working with. So that's been a significant kind of, if we look back on the Obama administration, that will be a legacy that I think has had an impact on lots of folks. But interestingly, there have always been parents that have kids in segregated settings that go to bat to protect those settings. So in Iowa, there are still two institutional settings that have much smaller populations than they once had, but they had very well organized parents who are protecting that option for their kids. What we're seeing now, and some of it is in response to leadership from the Obama administration really pushing community living and self-determination, is we're seeing that be questioned a lot of times by parents who have children on the autism spectrum. So these are younger parents with younger children who want to have a safe option for their child as an adult. And a lot of parents are gravitating towards things like autism farms, where you can work on a farm and be safe. And most of the people you interact with are going to be other people with disabilities. Or some parents have advocated for gated communities where, their adult children on the autism spectrum can live and they don't have to worry about them wandering off or getting hurt. But again, they're going to be lived behind closed doors. And you could think of both of these things as kind of gold-plated institutions. And there are a lot of folks in the disability field and in the federal government who are challenging those models. And the parents that are advocating for those models are organizing themselves nationally to push back against some of the leadership that we've seen from the Obama administration. So that's an example where I don't know where this is going to end up. I do think if you think about our university centers, I think there's a lot of value in actually listening to the parents that want an autism farm or want a gated community and understanding what are their concerns. If they have concerns about safety for their adult child with disability, I'm sure many of those concerns are legitimate. So the question is there a way to meet their concerns and not create models that we know historically result in a lower quality of life, lower self-esteem, a greater possibility of abuse or neglect? And is there a way to kind of find a way forward that these parents can support and that doesn't kind of recreate some of the history that we've been trying to move away from? And I'm happy to get more into that in the Q&A, but that's an example where I really feel like we're at a crossroads. Are we going to keep pushing the envelope of integration in the employment arena? Is the segregated or center-based employment model going to go away over time? Or are we going to see kind of a reemergence of that model in a way that ultimately can stand the test of time? And I don't know the answer to that. Another example of this kind of push and pull, No Child Left Behind was a federal law that required local education agencies to report on what was happening with vulnerable children in a lot more detail in terms of their test scores and other indicators of how much they were learning. We have a lot more detail than we did before that law was passed. Right now, Congress is on the verge of passing the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which is the old name of No Child Left Behind and the new name of it. And the Elementary and Secondary Education Act that passed the House and the Senate tries to create more flexibility for the states. And the concept is people on the ground are in a better position to make decisions about how to do accountability than the federal government is. And interestingly, No Child Left Behind has lots of critics on the left and the right. There are, teachers unions that are concerned that there's too much of a focus on tests and teachers are being held accountable for things that are outside of their control. And there are a lot of folks that don't like a big federal government that see No Child Left Behind as an overreach on the part of the federal government. So the bill that ultimately is going to get to the president's desk is probably going to have more flexibility in it for the states. And the entire civil rights community, including the disability community, is saying, we're losing subgroup accountability. We will not know how our kids are doing if an individual state decides not to measure that. And there should be a federal commitment to the civil rights of all of these students, so we should continue to have access to this data and we should be able to use it in our advocacy. So it's an area where we had a big step forward with No Child Left Behind. There were other negatives associated with that law, and now on this issue of accountability, we're probably going to take a step backwards. Another example is voting, right? And again, how many people here saw President Obama's speech in Selma when they were celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act? So in that speech, which I think is the best speech he's given as President of the United States, he mentioned people with disabilities when he was talking about voting, which I cried when I heard him say that because I just wasn't expecting it. It was a very powerful, overall it was a very powerful speech, and then the way he integrated the experience of voters with disabilities to me was really exciting and unexpected. But again, we had a step forward in the Help America Vote Act. I don't know if people remember that law after the 2000 elections when we had the big fight about the hanging chads in Florida and who was elected. Congress came together and passed a law, bipartisan, called the Help America Vote Act. One of the things that law said very clearly for the first time in statute was that people with disabilities have a right to vote privately and independently. And what had been happening for years before the passage of that law, if you were blind, you would go in with your spouse, with your brother, with your sister, with a friend, and they would read the ballot to you and you would tell them who you wanted to vote for. And there were a lot of people with other types of disabilities who weren't able to manipulate the voting equipment, so they relied on somebody else to help them. So now we had this law that said you have a right to vote privately and independently, but a movement grew up as that law was being implemented. Again, it was mostly progressives that didn't trust the voting equipment. They thought that elections would be stolen because the companies that ran the voting equipment were somehow going to monkey around with the equipment. So we found ourselves fighting with progressives about our right to vote privately and independently. And then more recently, there's been an effort led by conservatives in most states to combat fraud and require voter IDs and other things that make it more difficult for anybody to vote. But people with disabilities disproportionately get negatively impacted by things like voter ID laws because there are a lot of people with disabilities who don't drive and don't have a real reason to get a federal or a state ID. And then they find themselves going to the vote, and in the states that have voter ID requirements, it can be more difficult for people with disabilities to vote. So again, one step forward with the Help America Vote Act, but then pushback in different ways. Within the deaf community, I think there are a couple of interesting examples. One of them, I believe, was from Phoenix, from this area. There was an effort to build a retirement community for deaf seniors. Was this in Phoenix, Bill? Yeah. So a retirement community for deaf seniors that was like designed architecturally to kind of accommodate the kind of lines of sight that people would need to communicate. Some people call that deaf space. And there was pushback from the federal civil rights folks at HUD, at the Department of Housing and Urban Development, who were concerned that this was a segregated housing model. And you see that kind of concern also play out in the context of schools for the deaf, where folks have advocated that a school for the deaf is an old model because it's segregated, and it's better for deaf children to be educated in their neighborhood schools. The challenge with that is if you're the only deaf child in your neighborhood school, it's actually more isolating for you to get educated in that setting than it would be at a school for the deaf. If you can get a critical mass of deaf children, like where my wife went to high school in Memphis, it was a magnet high school in Memphis where deaf high school students went. There's a way to have that kind of integrated experience and to have a critical mass of deaf students, but we haven't figured out as a country how to deliver that everywhere a deaf child is getting educated. So we have a lot of deaf children that are getting educated in very isolated environments where the instructors who they're interacting with don't have a lot of cultural competence, and the accommodations that they're getting in terms of the quality of the interpreters or the availability of CART can be very limited. So you know that's another example where it's hard to know which is more integrated. For these deaf seniors, it seems to me it's very consistent with the Fair Housing Act to allow deaf seniors voluntarily to want to live together, just like members of a black sorority might want to go to a retirement home where other folks in their sorority live there. I mean, we choose as adults to connect with people across lots of identities, but the fair housing folks at HUD, it was a big fight, and I think it's still going on to get them to allow this. Am I right that that fight is still going on? Good, good. But it was a fight. Am I wrong? Yeah. So I just think these are examples where sometimes we don't even know kind of what is the right civil rights position. The last one, which is in some ways the biggest challenge we have in the disability field right now, is the fight between protecting our entitlement program. So like there's a big fight right now over the Social Security Disability Insurance Program where the trust fund is about to run out of money. So there are folks in the House and the Senate that are saying, well, if we're going to bail out this trust fund, let's deal with all the fraud that we see in this program and make sure the truly disabled people are the ones who are getting Social Security disability. And then there are folks in the disability field who are saying the problem is not fraud. The problem is that the program has a definition of disability that was written in 1956, and we're requiring people to get medical evidence that establishes that their disability prevents them from working, and that's not modern thinking about disability. Why don't we start with the assumption that people with disabilities can work, and the question is what supports are we willing to put around them to help them have success in the competitive labor force. So again, it's this interesting dynamic. If the fight is about fraud, groups like AUCD will lock arms with the rest of the disability community and will protect the program. But if we can have a conversation about how to modernize the program and make it work better for the people who are its intended beneficiaries, it's a much more interesting conversation. I think there's an opportunity for a bipartisan approach. So let me just touch briefly on, if we're at a tipping point on a lot of these issues or at a crossroads, what will determine ultimately how these issues get resolved? Segregation versus integration, center-based employment versus integrated employment versus no employment, the state flexibility issue versus accountability. Here are some of the things that I think are going to be important moving forward. One is consensus building and solidarity among disability organizations. When the disability community is not together on some of these issues, it makes it harder for us to win fights. And right now, there are important disability organizations on both sides of a lot of these issues. Another is new bipartisan champions at the federal, state, and local level. Senator Harkin retired at the end of last year. Senator Kennedy, who was another huge champion, died in 2010. We lost George Miller. He retired. He was the lead Democrat on the Education and the Workforce Committee from California in the House for like 20 years. Senator Rockefeller from West Virginia retired in January. He was the primary defender of Medicaid on the Finance Committee in the Senate, and Henry Waxman retired in January, and he was the Medicaid guru in the House. So we have very important champions who had long histories and staff that had long histories of knowing about these issues and being able to defend them against attacks that happen naturally in the congressional environment. And now we have the responsibility to identify new champions and work with them. I think another important thing that we're going to see more and more is leadership from the business community. A lot of the work that we've done in the disability realm has not been led by the business community. The business community did not play a big role in getting the ADA passed. They did not oppose it as a community. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce supported it. The small business lobby opposed it, but the small business lobby opposes just about every civil rights law. But it's an interesting question. Is there a way for the private sector, without being pushed by the federal government, to go beyond what the law requires? So just a couple of examples. Walgreens had a senior vice president, Randy Lewis, who had a son on the autism spectrum, and he was in charge of all of their distribution centers in the country. Walgreens has 247,000 employees. They're a big employer. The distribution centers were a big part of their business because the distribution centers were all the products that show up in their pharmacies. They all go through a distribution center and out to the pharmacies. And they were building a brand new distribution center in Anderson, South Carolina. And Randy said, let's set a goal that 40% of our employees in this distribution center will be people with disabilities. And he convinced the CEO of Walgreens and others. They went along. They had no idea how they were going to meet this goal. They found partners in South Carolina to help them build a pipeline. The center was built. They met the goal, and the center was successful. So then they built a new distribution center in Connecticut, and they said, let's try it for 50%. That center in Windsor, Connecticut now has 50% of their employees are people with disabilities, and they have found that these two distribution centers are outperforming all of their other distribution centers on metrics that they care about. Turnover, employee engagement, meaning how the employees, everybody in that distribution center feels about their employer and about going to work. Accidents at the job, time out of work, productivity, all these things that matter. And people that do distribution, their lives are obsessed with metrics. All the metrics that they care about, they were outperforming all the other distribution centers. So on the one hand, they weren't required to do that by federal law. That was one dad who was in the right place at the right time, who had the right personality to kind of convince others that did it. And now the whole distribution center field has acolytes of Randy Lewis that are trying to do this with Starbucks and with Lowe's and with Walmart and with other companies that have a lot of distribution centers. That's an example where the private sector led without waiting for the federal government to tell them what to do. And we were talking earlier with the Disabled Student Services Office here. Is it called the Disability Resource Center? We were talking earlier, it's one thing to just comply with the federal law and know what the federal law requires and meet those requirements. And it's another thing to really think about, is there a way we can have a universal design approach and do things that aren't required by federal law, but that will solve the problem in a more systematic way for our students. And I think if all employers had that kind of an attitude when they think about recruiting, retaining, promoting employees with disabilities, it will lead to innovation that will be faster than anything that we can require legislatively. So again, I think leadership from the business community will be critical. And then this ADA generation, these young folks who have very high expectations for themselves, who have a civil rights frame, who are comfortable in their own skin and have pride in their identity as people with disabilities. As this generation enters the workforce, they will be pushing, I think, culture change at the university, at the employers in a way that will accelerate progress. So, I think there's a lot of positive and a lot of negatives happening at once right now as we celebrate these anniversaries. Congress, in the last Congress, had two major bipartisan victories, the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act and the ABLE Act. The Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act was the reauthorization of the vocational rehabilitation program and all of the workforce development programs for the country. The last time it had been reauthorized was 1998. That was a 5-year reauthorization. So it took Congress 11 years to reauthorize that law. But it was very bipartisan, and it has a lot of good provisions in it that say vocational rehabilitation needs to do a better job serving young people with disabilities while they're still in school. And we need to stop tracking young people from school into sheltered workshops or segregated settings and give every young person an opportunity to experience competitive integrated employment before they end up anywhere else. That provision in WIOA passed with overwhelming bipartisan support in a Congress that was not accomplishing a lot. I think the last Congress may have been, in terms of their legislative output, may have been one of the lowest legislative outputs in the history of Congress. But they did pass this law. Another law that they passed was the ABLE Act, which stands for Achieving a Better Life Experience. But the ABLE Act basically takes the model of a college savings account, which is something that parents can do at the state level, put money in a college savings account and experience tax advantages, and then use that money to help their child go to college. They said, why don't we create accounts like this for families that have children with lifelong disabilities, where they can set aside money for their kid, and then the kid can tap into that money as an adult to pay for things that they need related to their disability, and not lose their eligibility for federal disability benefits like supplemental security income or Medicaid. And that law, again, passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. So I feel like that's the most recent expression of Congress of what they want. They want high expectations for young people and better services while they're in school, and they want folks to have more than what they get from SSI and Medicaid. And I feel like we can build on those themes to really build out a robust bipartisan agenda to modernize the disability entitlement programs and to make the vocational rehabilitation system do a better job of serving the entire population, including young people with very significant, very complex disabilities, which historically vocational rehabilitation has not done a great job of serving. So, those are some positives. I talked about the Obama administration's leadership. I'm excited that Tammy Duckworth, a disabled veteran, is running for Senate in Illinois against Mark Kirk, who had a stroke while he was in the Senate. So both candidates for one of the most high-profile Senate races in the country for Barack Obama's Senate seat are candidates with disabilities. And they're both comfortable incorporating their disability identity. Senator Kirk was one of the lead Republican champions, along with your Senator John McCain, to get UN ratification of the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. And part of the reason he came around to supporting that was his own experience with his own disability and the inaccessibility that he encountered in the United States Senate. One of our secret weapons in the disability field is we're constantly acquiring new allies. People acquire disabilities every day. Jesse Helms, who was one of the biggest critics of the ADA, was riding around in a scooter before he retired from the Senate. So sometimes these things are ironic. And then the other thing that was exciting to me was Jeb Bush's introductory video when he announced to the world that he was running for president. He featured Berthy De La Rosa Ponte, a mom from Florida, and her daughter on the autism spectrum, Luce, and talked about how he wanted to create better opportunities for people with developmental disabilities. This was in a 3-minute introduction of Jeb Bush to the electorate. So something was working there in terms of him seeing that his leadership as governor on this issue was something that would matter enough to primary voters, because ultimately that's who you're communicating with, primary voters on the Republican side, that this message about leadership on developmental disabilities would somehow help him. Now, it doesn't look like it's helping him that much so far, but the fact that he wanted to do that, to me, again, is a sign of progress. And then, I talked a lot about some of the alarming trends. I don't want to dwell on it. I think the bottom line is our community has not yet arrived as a political constituency that matters. If you think about the number of voters who care about disability issues when they're voting, you're talking about people with disabilities, you're talking about parents, siblings, family members, you're talking about special educators, you're talking about occupational therapists, physical therapists, developmental pediatricians, all these professionals that go through our interdisciplinary training programs at our lens and our USEDs, that's a lot of people. It's not a small population. And when candidates poll the voters, there is no major party candidate that wants to know how are voters with disabilities reacting to my message. Senator Harkin did that occasionally. He would identify voters with disabilities, but he was a way exception to the rule. So something doesn't compute here. We know we're big, we know we matter, and yet we haven't made the business case to the politicians or the political case to the politicians where they're actually testing their messages against us who care about these issues and trying to figure out how to talk about our issues in a way that makes us want to vote for them. I don't know if you all watched Sarah Palin's speech when she was introduced at the Republican convention, but one of her powerful lines was, for the parents with disabilities who are out there, I want you to know that if you elect me, you will have an advocate in the White House. And she said it like that. It was a direct appeal to voters, but that's so unusual that we notice it when people actually do it. She had a kid with Down syndrome, and she cared enough about that issue to put it in her speech at the convention. So I want to get to the Q&A, but I'm going to close with a quote from Martin Luther King, which I think is very appropriate for where we find ourselves right now with Donald Trump and other phenomena that are playing out in the presidential election. Martin Luther King said that human progress is neither automatic nor inevitable. Even a superficial look at history reveals that no social advance rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. Every step towards the goal of justice requires sacrifice, suffering, and struggle, the tireless exertions and passionate concerns of dedicated individuals. This next sentence, I think, was directly relevant for the Donald Trump phenomenon. He said, without persistent effort, time itself becomes an ally of the insurgent and primitive forces of irrational emotionalism and social destruction. He said, this is no time for apathy or complacency. This is a time for vigorous and positive action. Friends, you are the dedicated individuals that Dr. King was talking about. I was really inspired by what I learned today, what's happening here in your Disability Resource Center at the University Center for Excellence on this campus, and I'm honored to be here with you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Because this is being live streamed, we need people who have questions to use microphones. So if you let me know, I'll get you a microphone. And if if somebody wants to help me, they can grab one of the microphones. Suzanne, do you want to? Thanks. So, questions?
Yep. And if folks could introduce themselves when they ask a question or make a comment, that'd be great.
I'm Steve Freeman. I work with Direct Center for Independence. And you brought up the autism farms and the gated communities and how the families feel about setting those up. And I've talked to some families that are really passionate about that issue. And you said you would go into more about that issue. How can we address that and help those families know that there might be other options that would work for them? Because they don't see there are other options out there for them.
Right. I think it's a great question, and I don't know that there's a simple answer, but I feel like part of it is by listening to them in a non-judging way and listening for what their primary concerns are, and then trying to work. Let's assume that they have concerns that these alternatives that are integrated don't exist, and I'm sure in some places that's a fair concern. So then the issue is, how are we working together to make sure that these alternatives do exist? And to the extent that there's an alternative to a farm, it may actually be a farm, but it's an integrated farm. Is there a way to work together to build those models? And I feel like if we can get out of the us and them and the judging and assume that they have good motivations of love as a parent and try to find a way to work with them to meet their needs and learn from our history as a country of what happens in segregated settings and share with them the evidence of what happens in segregated settings, I feel like there's a way forward where everybody can support the way forward. The thing about the autism issue for me, it kind of reminds me of HIV/AIDS in the 80s. There's a lot of urgency in autism. There are a lot of parents that are at their wits' end, and they're trying to figure out, how to make their family function in an environment where the right answers are not always apparent to them. Politically, that urgency is powerful. You get a group of parents of young adults on the autism spectrum going to talk to a senator like Senator Menendez from New Jersey. Senator Menendez is going to want to do something for them. He sees the energy, he sees the passion, he sees the crisis that they're facing and wants to try to help solve it. So I feel like there's an opportunity for us as a movement to tap into that energy and urgency and try to work with them to find a way forward that can have the broad support of the disability community and that will benefit the entire disability community. One of the interesting statistics, if you just think about intellectual and developmental disabilities like autism, the vast majority of adults that have developmental disabilities in this country are being taken care of by their parents and are not participating in any government program. So we have kind of a group of parents that are stepping up and delivering services in segregated settings. It's called their house. Because our programs they're nowhere near the size to meet the demand. That's why we have, I know I heard Arizona is kind of unusual that you don't have waiting lists, but a lot of states we have long waiting lists for families to get the services that they want. So to me, this is about listening, not judging, and trying to find a way to move forward and studying different models and making the case. This is what it will do for your kid and their quality of life if you go with this model as opposed to this model. And I'm hopeful that if we do more of that, the bitter fights that go on where you have 100 parents show up at a hearing or whatever, all angry that you're taking away something from their kid, we can avoid that.
Other questions?
Here in the front? Or maybe we'll go in the back and work our way down. Yeah.
It's my turn?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, yeah, sorry. My name is Gannon Zeiser. And I didn't hear you explicitly address this, but seems like whenever time a politician shows interest in a minority group, not just disabled, but also, gay, lesbian, that they personally have a relationship or a child that is of, either gay, lesbian, disabled, you name it. Do you think that that's what it takes to see political action, or can you name any exceptions? Tom
Sure.
Harkin, for instance?
Sure. I would say the answer to that is it helps when a politician has a personal experience because they can take the issue from an intellectual issue and make it more in the heart, which I think politically is very helpful. They can tell stories from their own experience that can change the way other elected officials think about the issue. But there are lots of examples of people that have no personal connection to disability that have shown great leadership. I would say the best recent example was Governor Jack Markell from Delaware. When he was the chair of the National Governors Association, he made employment of people with disabilities his signature issue. And he said repeatedly that it wasn't because he had any personal connection, but while he was, I think, Secretary of State in Delaware, or maybe state treasurer, he visited a Bank of America facility that was employing people with intellectual disabilities to make promotional materials. And he asked one of the young people that was working there, what were you doing before you were working here? And he said, for 10 years I sat at home with my parents and watched television. And that had a real impact on the governor, future governor. And his initiative got a lot of other governors talking, okay, what can we do to get more people with disabilities in the labor force? So I do think we find allies in strange places, and some of those allies don't have any personal connection to disability, but they still feel moved to do something about it.
And you mentioned Senator Menendez. Was that his name? He's another example.
Absolutely. I'm not aware of any personal connection that he has, but he's from New Jersey, which has one of the highest autism incidences in the country, lots of parents, going to him asking for leadership, and he was the lead on this autism piece of legislation, which is now called Autism Cares, but it authorizes a lot of research and it authorizes our interdisciplinary training programs to try to improve quality of life of people on the autism spectrum.
Okay, so one more thing. As an expert, you have hope. It wouldn't be wise to be cynical about this kind of thing.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's funny. I can spin everything I said where it's all very depressing, and I can spin it where I feel like we're on the verge of incredible progress. And because I'm bipolar, depending on the day, I may feel one way or another. But generally, I do have hope. I feel like we're on the verge of a lot of positive progress.
We have someone up front.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Jovan, and I'm a law student here. In studying law, something that was of concern was that in tort law in particular, people with mental disabilities are held to the same standard as what they call, a reasonable person.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think one of the concerns for the in the case of a gated community is that liability for people with mental disabilities is the same as someone without mental disabilities. Whereas opposed to physical disabilities, their liability would be the same as other people with physical disabilities. Now, my question is, do you know of any movement in state legislatures, in particular, to change that standard, or maybe even, Supreme Court?
So I think your question is framed as tort law, but it could be framed more broadly to include criminal law.
Correct.
And other aspects of law. I mean, so in the criminal world, it's okay in this country to have capital punishment, but the Supreme Court ruled that capital punishment is cruel and unusual when it's applied to somebody with an intellectual disability. And one of the reasons that they wanted to create that exception to their jurisprudence around capital punishment is they were concerned that there would be people with intellectual disabilities who wouldn't understand what they were doing and the consequences of what they were doing. And it felt to them like it would be cruel and unusual punishment to subject them to the death penalty in that consequence. My feeling on all of this is this is complicated stuff. Because if you assume people with mental disabilities, I have a mental disability, bipolar disorder. If you assume people with mental disabilities don't understand the consequences of their actions, that can lead to a lot of paternalism towards people with mental disabilities, and it can be harder for us to exercise self-determination. So to me, there is some value in holding people with mental disabilities to the same standards as you would hold other folks, and trying to find a way to explain right and wrong and consequences of your actions in a way that people with mental disabilities can understand it. So I think, you're right that the concern about gated communities is a safety concern. And I'm sure for some sophisticated parents, one of the things they're worried about is their kid getting sued for assaulting somebody or hurting somebody without necessarily understanding the consequences of their actions. But I don't think that's the primary reason parents are attracted to farms or gated communities. I think the primary reason is they feel like their kid is going to be safe and they don't have to worry about them, and they don't have to worry that they're going to wander into the street and die or some other really bad thing is going to happen to their kid.
Thank you.
I have from our live streaming a question.
Great.
From Rachel. As a person with a disability, how can you best get involved in the disability rights movement?
Great question. I'm impressed that we can take questions from the... I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, I started out working in the disability movement after I graduated from law school when I worked at the Disability Law Center. So I was around lawyers with and without disabilities. I had this disability that I was coming to terms with. And one of the lawyers in the agency had dyslexia and had a lot of pride around it. Her name was Debbie Pilch. She was a proud woman with dyslexia, proud disabled woman. She felt a real strong connection with Linda Long, who was a lawyer that worked there who had spina bifida. and other folks. So I kind of saw, well, if Debbie Pilch can do this with dyslexia, I should be able to do this with bipolar disorder. I mean, part of it is having role models that allow you to feel comfortable to be part of this movement and be a leader in this movement, even if you don't look like a traditional person with a disability. If we can define the disability movement broadly enough where deaf people who may not ever be comfortable with the word disability still feel a connection to this bigger movement that got us the ADA and other civil rights laws, to me, it's all very powerful. I think right now in 2015, the easiest way to get involved in this movement is on social media. You know, it's by following folks on Twitter. By the way, for those of you on Twitter, I'm at Andy AUCD on Twitter, connecting with people on Facebook. And AUCD, our official Twitter feed is at AUCD News on Twitter. And then, you know, experimenting. There was a great poem written by a disability leader in Colorado called You Get Proud by Practicing. And the concept of disability pride doesn't come naturally. And for a lot of us, we may be the first person in our family that has our disability, so we don't have the natural family grooming to be comfortable in your own skin that happens with other, you know, disadvantaged groups or protected classes. So part of it is us finding a way to talk about our disabilities, claiming our disabilities as part of our identity. And it's the first time you do it, it may feel awkward. You may feel like an imposter syndrome kind of moment. And I think it takes time to really get comfortable in your own skin. But I think it's very sad that young people with disabilities, while they're in elementary school, they're not given more opportunity to develop their disability pride and to kind of develop their own self-advocacy skills, because I think that's one of the most important things you can learn as a person with a lifelong disability while you're still in school.
Other questions?
In the back?
Hi, I'm Brandy Kitzberger. I'm a high school teacher for Project Search. And my question has to do with funding. As you know, most states in the union, especially with disability, there's a lot of issues that revolve around funding. And my question is what are some innovative examples of whether it's communities or states that are providing services for people with less? So what do you have any options out there, any ideas?
You're saying, how do states in a climate of scarcity find ways to provide services without necessarily relying heavily on the government?
Right. Or with the government, but, you know, kind of cut through that bureaucratic tape, because I find that that's always an issue when I'm working with VR or DD. It's a struggle to get through it, to actually give the services to that person.
So I'll give two answers. One is kind of a government reform answer, and the other is an outside the government answer. So in terms of government reform, one of the things that I really try to emphasize with vocational rehabilitation leaders is right now at the federal level, we spend about $4 billion a year on vocational rehabilitation. It's not an entitlement program. It's a program that is grounded in scarcity. Many states have order of selection or other ways of really limiting who can get the VR resources. So that's $4 billion a year. Does anybody know how much we're spending a year on Social Security, disability insurance, supplemental security income, Medicaid, and Medicare? It's about $500 billion a year. So if you're a vocational rehabilitation leader, one of the opportunities for you is to find a way to be part of the solution of how we're going to modernize the $500 billion. So we're not supporting people outside the labor force in poverty, and instead we're trying to build people's human capital and build some evidence-based supports around them like Project Search, so that we're actually, if you take all the money we're spending to support people with disabilities, we're getting better outcomes. I remember having this conversation with the VR director in Iowa, who's a very innovative VR director, and I said to him, if you were in charge of not just your VR budget, but the entire Medicaid budget that serves the VR population, how would you spend the Medicaid dollars differently? And that's where the money is. at the state level, that's where the money is. So if we want to see better employment outcomes for adults with significant disabilities, like the Project Search target population, part of that is a Medicaid reform conversation. Medicaid has to be clear about the outcomes that they want. This new definition of community role says that adults with disabilities should have the same choices in their lives that other adults take for granted. There's a bias towards integration and self-determination. So Medicaid needs to put their money where their mouth is and support folks in integrated settings using evidence-based interventions like Project Search. So that's my public sector answer. My private sector answer is I'm very intrigued by social entrepreneurs. There's this whole movement, and it's an international movement, using business principles to solve social problems. And I really feel like a lot of the problems that we have in disability would benefit from more business people, and I kind of tried to get at this when I talked about leadership from the business community, but people with business skills trying to build businesses that are sustainable, that don't rely heavily on the government. So for Project Search, is there a way to build out that model where you're not relying heavily on vocational rehabilitation or Medicaid or any other public payer, but somehow you find a way to deliver enough value to the hospital or whoever it is that's hiring the folks that they are completely funding the program and feel like they're getting a huge return on that investment. That's not always going to be possible. Some of the issues in the disability world we're not going to be able to build a business around, but I would love to have more business people thinking about these issues. So as I've gone to LEND programs in my first 2 years, these are interdisciplinary training programs, I keep encouraging them to reach out to their business school and have a LEND trainee who's a business person learning with the occupational therapists and the physical therapists and the law students and the others who participate and applying that skill set. And I just feel like we as a movement can learn a lot from social entrepreneurs.
We probably have time for one or two more questions. Yeah? Okay.
My name's Dan Perino with Tucson Unified School District. My question is that we see a lot more interest by families and students to participate in institutions of higher education and be able to do that.
Yeah.
Earlier you talked about kind of the disability community and kind of the pushback and depending on how they're looking at it. What has been your experience or perspective with regards to students with intellectual disabilities being able to go on to institutions of higher education?
Yeah, it's a great question. We talked about that at lunch. For me, the growth of inclusive higher education programs for students with intellectual disabilities is a really interesting and exciting phenomenon. I think we're still working out how to do that in a way where the student with intellectual disability has the same kinds of college experience that students without intellectual disabilities have. They're clearly getting something out of it. The university is clearly getting something out of it. And there are outcomes that we can point to where it was a good return on investment. There are a lot of different models out there right now. Some institutions of higher ed will have a certificate program for students with intellectual disabilities, but they won't let them live on the campus. And then there are other models where they can live on the campus. For some students, that's a big deal. Part of the college experience is living on the campus. So I feel like that's something that we need to work out. Again, there are safety issues, there are other issues, but usually where there's a will, there's a way, and certainly some of the programs like at University of North Carolina, Greensboro, they have integrated students with intellectual disabilities into the housing. But I think what we talked about at lunch is I feel like it starts with what's the mission of the institution of higher education. And I feel like right now, higher ed is changing a lot. Those questions keep getting asked as a lot of the business model of higher ed changes. The student debt issues keep getting front and center. And I think there's an opportunity for institutions of higher ed to really think hard about who are we not serving, not just students with intellectual disabilities, but who are the populations in our communities that we're not serving, and is there a way either in partnership with community colleges or on our own that we can reach a broader population where they're benefiting from it and we're benefiting from it. And I definitely believe that that's possible, but it's not always simple. Another issue with these certificate programs is they can be incredibly expensive. At the University of Iowa, it's $50,000 a year to send your kid with an intellectual disability to this certificate program. Obviously, that's going to price out lots of families from participating. So I think this is stuff that we're working out. I'm really happy that you have a program here at the University of Arizona, and I think we should study it. I mean, this is something that needs to be evaluated, not just what's the experience of the students with intellectual disabilities, but how does it impact the climate and the experience of all the students here at this campus.
Well, let me ask the last question then. And for everyone, we have a reception outside. Andy's going to be around. You can certainly talk to him, one-on-one. But I guess what I'd like to ask to end it is listening to you and all the changes on the horizon and what's happening. What do you think is the one thing all of us should take away and do in our lives that maybe we aren't now to kind of forward this movement, to make sure that the policy developed is good for families and communities and people with disabilities?
Yeah, I mean, I think my kind of the biggest takeaway I would encourage folks to think about it is Dr. King's message that progress is neither automatic nor inevitable. So let's assume there are a lot of folks in this room who are directly impacted by whether we get the policies right for people with disabilities, and there are others in this room where their loved ones are directly impacted, and then there are folks who aren't directly impacted. My message is this will directly impact all of you. Disability is an equal opportunity status. We will all need these features at some point in our life. So make it your business to engage in vigorous and positive action. Make it your business. Justin Dart used to say, get into politics as your life depends upon it, because it does. Make it your business to show up at candidates forums and town hall meetings. Make it your business to vote. Make it your business to encourage other people to vote, and be part of the vigorous and positive action, and don't assume that there's somebody else who's going to do it.
Thank you. So please join us. There's refreshments outside, and Andy, I know, would love to stick around and talk with all of you.